Chapter 2 this evening. 2 Samuel chapter 2. In the first chapter of 2 Samuel, David found out that Saul and Jonathan had died, and he mourned over Saul and Jonathan. But now that we're into chapter 2, David is looking more directly at the idea of him becoming the king that God had promised that he would become. And so it starts in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel. Chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, "It happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" Now remember, he is down in the land of the Philistines. He's in Ziklag because he was running away from Saul. But now he's saying, should I go home? Should I return back to Judah? And I think in particular, he's thinking, should I go up and be made king? Is it time for that yet or not? And you notice that God promised him this all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, when David was anointed by Samuel, and when he was told he would become king. It's been probably about 15 years, or maybe give or take a little bit, since that happened. And so he's been waiting for quite some time. Not that he seems very eager for Saul to have died, but he's been waiting for quite some time for that promise to be fulfilled. But even now that Saul is dead, he still is going, and he's asking God before he goes up, should I do this or not? And so God says, the Lord said to him, go up. And David said, where shall I go up? And so he says specifically to Hebron. Now, Hebron, you remember the story of Caleb and how he goes up and he conquers the giants on the top of the mountain? That's Hebron. That's where he's going. It's a city up on a mountain. It's a very well-defended city. It's a city that has lots and lots of water all around it, and so it's very easy to survive in Hebron, even if, say, someone tries to attack you. Lots of water. It's also a city of refuge. They designated these cities as places that you could go if you accidentally killed somebody and you needed to go to run away from the avenger of blood. You could go there, and it's kind of neat because Caleb conquers it, but then he turns around and he gives it to the Levites. Remember, they gave some of their cities to the Levites to live in. So he conquers this city and then he gives it to the Levites. That's where God tells David to go, to this Levite city, a city of refuge. And so verse 2, David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household. And so they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. And so they're there on that mountain. And then the men come to him in verse 4. The men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the one who buried Saul. And so, you notice he's not the king over the whole nation yet. He's just the king over the tribe. They just have agreed that in the absence of Saul being dead, that he's going to be the leader of their tribe. Now, David knows, God has promised him, he'll be the leader over all the kingdom eventually. But so far, he's just the king of Judah. And so as king, they're giving him the information that he needs to know. Saul's body was recovered. We read about that in chapter 31 of the last book, 1 Samuel, and was buried by the people of Jabesh Gilead. Now, Jabesh Gilead, if you go back to 1 Samuel 11, Jabesh Gilead was the first place that Saul rescued when he became king. And he became king with the promise that he would defend the people. And so when a foreign country comes in and tries to attack Jabesh Gilead, Saul goes and he saves them. That's why they're so fond of him. That's why they go and they rescue his body. He saved them from destruction. And so they tell him this is where Saul's body is. And so David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead in verse 5, and he said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you this kindness, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strengthened, and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. And so, now Jabesh Gilead, they're not Benjamites, they're from the tribe of Manasseh, but they're clearly very influential among the people who like Saul, because they risk their necks to go get Saul's body. They are an influential group, and so David is trying to keep the peace among all of the tribes. And so he writes, and notice he never treats Saul like an enemy, even though Saul tried to kill him. Even through all of this, he's very complimentary to them for honoring Saul, and not saying, well, you shouldn't have done that because he tried to kill me. He's promising to protect them in verse 6, the same way that Saul had protected them. He's saying, I can be that kind of king who's there for you if enemies ever try to attack you. And he's, in essence, in verse 7, he's asking them to kind of lead the way for the rest of the nation to accept him as king. If this kind of pro-Saul city says, we want David to be king, then maybe all the rest of the nation will say, well, we could do that too. We could go along with that. And he's trying to keep the peace here, but that, of course, is not what Saul's family has in mind. And so you pick up in verse 8, and it mentions a man named Abner, the son of Ner. He was the commander of Saul's army. We'd seen him in 1 Samuel. And he took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and he brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. And so Abner is Saul's cousin, and he was the one that led Saul's army. And so you've got these two families that were fixing to divide the line down, because Abner is related to Saul, and he is taking Saul's son, Ishbosheth, one of the only remaining sons left. And Ishbosheth, as we'll learn, it says here in verse 10, it says, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, he was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years, and only the house of Judah followed David. And so we talk about the split after Solomon, when 10 of the tribes followed after Jeroboam, thank you, and then the rest of them followed with Rehoboam and the line of David. But it actually happens before then too, and you have all of the tribes following Ishbosheth except for Judah, and he's only king over Judah. And so Saul is dead. Abner here, his cousin, has taken his son and has declared him to be king. Now, this is going to lead to, in essence, a civil war that lasts, as you can see there in verse 10, it lasts about 2 years until this man dies. A civil war that lasts about 2 years. And so verse 11, it says, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now, 2 years in, he becomes king over all of them. But it's kind of giving you a little look into the future, that in his 40-year reign, he spends 7.5 of them in Hebron. Hebron is the capital for 7.5 years. And it'll explain that again as we get further into it. But that's the place where he's going to be reigning from for these first 7.5 years. Any thoughts or comments on what we've looked at so far? Okay, picking up then in verse 12, we get to the war. It says that Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And then Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. And so they sat down, one on the one side of the pool, and the other on the other side of the pool. Now here you really do. You have the house of Saul versus the house of David. Right? We already have Abner. He's Saul's cousin. Joab is David's nephew. And he's one of three. If you skip down, you can look in verse 18. And it talks about the three sons of Zeruiah, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Zeruiah is David's sister, and you can read about that in 1 Chronicles if you want to. Zeruiah is David's sister, and so these three men are his nephews, and they're part of his army. And so it really is, it's Saul's family against David's family here. And so Joab and the servants of David, it says, they meet on the two sides of this pool. Now this is in the town of Gibeon, and you all remember Gibeon because Gibeon is the city that tricked Joshua. You know, when Joshua went into the land, he was supposed to destroy everybody. Gibeon is the one that they dressed themselves in what looked like old clothing and old sandals, and they had old wineskins and moldy bread, and they tricked Joshua into making that treaty. That's Gibeon. And so at this point, Gibeon has been, the people who live there are the Benjamites. And they built this giant pool. They took this limestone rock and they dug way down into it, and it had all these steps kind of circling down into the bottom of it where they could get to water in cases where the city was being attacked and you can't leave the city to get water. They built this kind of deep pool where they could go down and get water for the people in the city. And so they're basically on two sides of this giant limestone hole and facing off against one another. And it says in verse 14, it says, Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." And so they arose and went over by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. And in essence, what you're looking at is almost a David and Goliath situation. You remember how Goliath was the champion of the Philistines, and David was the champion of the Israelites. And basically, whoever won, whoever killed them, that kind of decided the battle, in essence. And so when David defeated Goliath, the Israelites chased the Philistines down, and they won that day. That's basically what they're doing here. They have these 12 men, and instead of the whole army fighting, they said, well, we'll let these 12 men fight, and whoever last man standing wins. It's kind of like that game that we played at game night a few weeks ago, where everyone lined up, and then Steve kept grabbing it before anybody else could, and he was the last man standing. There were two teams, if you weren't there, or black and red. Is that what it was? At one point, Steve was the only person from his team, and there were multiple people from other teams. And he ended up winning after several rounds. He won the whole thing because he just kept. Yeah, it's kind of like that. But in this instance here, sorry, Steve, that was fun to watch. So in this instance here, it says that verse 16, as each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together, and therefore the place was called the Field of Sharp Swords, which is in Gibeon. In essence, nobody won. They were so perfectly matched that they all ended up defeating each other, all 24 men, and there was no winner at the end of the day. And what he's kind of building to here in this section is that this is the tragedy when brother fights brother, when countrymen fights countrymen, the tragedy of civil war. There really is, in essence, a lot of loss involved with that. And you think about in America, the war that had the greatest American casualties or fatalities was the Civil War. 200,000 plus more people died in the Civil War, Americans, than any other war that we have fought in, because when brother fights brother, that's when you have the greatest amount of loss. And so he continues, verse 17, it says, there was a very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. And so it ended up having a battle anyway. They tried to just do it with these 24 men, but they end up having a battle anyway. Now here in verse 18, it gives us a specific moment of that battle. It says the three sons of Zeruiah, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, these are David's nephews. And Asahel was as fleet as foot as a wild gazelle. This is something he was known for. He was just a very speedy, fast guy. And so verse 19, Asahel pursued Abner, and in going he did not turn to the right hand or to the left from following Abner. He puts Abner in his sight and he says, I'm not stopping until I've caught him. I'm not stopping until I've caught up with him. And Abner looked behind him and he said, are you Asahel? Right? He's heard of this guy, clearly. He knows about this speedy person in David's family. And so Asahel says, I am. And Abner said to him, he says, turn aside to your right hand or to your left. Lay hold on one of the young men and take his armor for yourself. But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. Now, taking somebody else's armor, basically that was a way of declaring that, you had defeated somebody. Right? It's the trophy of war. He says, in other words, he says, pick on somebody else, right? Go. There's a lot of people here that you could easily defeat. Go pick on one of those and take his armor instead of chasing after me." But Asahel doesn't. He keeps following him. And so Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab?" Now he's concerned. He says, if I kill you, I know that Joab is going to be mad at me. Now we've seen Joab in 1 Samuel. He's a pretty war-happy guy. He's a pretty violent person. He doesn't want to make an enemy of Joab by killing his brother. Now you think about this. If Abner had been fighting a foreign army, would he have warned the guy behind him, "Don't keep chasing me or I'm going to kill you"? If he had been fighting the Philistines, he would have just killed the guy behind him. That's what you do in war. If someone's chasing you down to kill you, you just kill them. He warns him because he knows about him. He knows Joab because these are distant relatives, because they're all Israelites, because they're brothers. It changes things when brothers or brothers and sisters fight with one another because of the knowledge and the intimacy, the familiarity with one another. There's this hesitancy to follow through with the act. But verse 23, however, he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear, so that the spear came out of his back, and he fell down there, and he died on the spot. And so it was that as many came to the place where Asahel fell down and died, they stood still. And you kind of wonder, Asahel was clearly right behind him. Why didn't Asahel go ahead and kill him? Now maybe he just hadn't quite caught up to him yet. I don't know. Or was there a sense of hesitancy there? Because while they are enemies, they're relatives from the tribes of Israel. That David loved Saul despite all the things that Saul did to him. That these are brothers in essence, and they're fighting one another. All right, any comments on what we've looked at so far? All right, verse 24 then. They come to a kind of momentary truce. Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner. These are the dead man's brothers, Joab and Abishai. They also pursued Abner. And the sun was going down when they came to the hill of Ammah, which is before Giah by the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. Right? Basically, they've run so many miles, and they've come to kind of this small mountain. And the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner, and they became a unit, and they took their stand on the top of the hill. Right? And so Benjamin, while they were losing, they now have the high ground. Right? They're up on a hill. David's men are down at the bottom of the hill. You know, if you have the high ground, strategically speaking, you have the better position. And so Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be until you tell the people to return?" And notice how he phrases it, "from pursuing their brethren," right? From pursuing their own flesh and blood in essence. And so he says, isn't this enough bloodshed for one day? How long until you tell everyone to go home? And Joab says, "As God lives, unless you had spoken, surely then by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." In other words, Abner has the high ground, and Joab is saying, we were fixing to give up anyway, right? We were almost done anyway for today. And so Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still, and they did not pursue Israel anymore, nor did they fight anymore. And Abner and his men went on all that night through the plain. They crossed over the Jordan. They went through all Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim. Now that's kind of the capital that they've set up for Ishbosheth. And then Joab also returned from pursuing Abner. And when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men plus Asahel. So David has lost 20 people. They've died in the battle. Verse 31, but the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360 men who died. And so just from a numbers perspective, if you ask who won the first battle, it's clearly David. It's clearly Joab and the kingdom of Judah. And so they took up Asahel. They buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. They returned to David's capital, where he was for 7.5 years. And there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. This was just the first battle of many, but David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. And it's this interaction between these men, I think, really does bring out their hesitancy, they're fighting, but they're kind of not wanting to, the truce that they make. And it's not so it's similar, you could say, to what the New Testament describes when brothers and sisters in Christ fight. You think about James chapter 4 and verse 1. In James chapter 4 and verse 1, James talks about, you could call it warfare between Christians, which is a thing, unfortunately, that does happen sometimes. And he says in chapter 4 and verse 1, he says, "Where do the wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and you do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, and yet you do not have, because you do not ask. Or you ask and you do not receive, because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses," that's a hard word to say. "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." And so he's writing to these Christians, and he's saying that their warfare, in essence, that he's using that language, the fighting, whatever it is that they're fighting about that's going on between them, is not really all that different from warfare, that they're harming each other, and it's all just out of selfishness, all because they just want to fulfill their own lust or their own pleasures. You think about 3 John verse 9. Here's a kind of very specific example. In the book of 3 John, and in verse 9, John says that he wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, one of the people in that church, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prattling against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. It says, "Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God." And so there's this man, Diotrephes, and he's basically declared war on members of the church, and says, if you want to fellowship with this Christian over here, then you can't worship here with us. You can't be here any longer. Not based off of doctrinal things, but just based off whatever he loves, the preeminence, right? He loves the spotlight. Whatever his lust or desire was that day, that's what he based it off of. And then John says this is a dangerous and a terrible thing. He says, "Do not imitate those who do evil. Imitate those who do good." And so there's kind of this Old Testament picture of how hard and terrible it is when brothers and sisters fight, and why it's so important that we strive for unity in every possible way. All right. Any thoughts or comments there before we move into chapter 3?
Maybe they got conscience,
I'm sorry?
It was bothering their conscience.
Sure. Yeah. And I think it should, if we're fighting among each other, it should bother our conscience, and that's something that we should stop and listen to and say, is there a reason for that? Because yes, ma'am, I think so. All right, chapter 3 and verse 2 then, it kind of zooms out a little bit and shows us how David's family grows while he's in Hebron. And so these were the sons that were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and his second son was Chileab, which also could be translated Daniel, by Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And so these two women we kind of know already. The first woman that we know of that he married was Michal, Saul's daughter. But you remember that when David had to run from Saul, Saul took Michal and he married her to somebody else. And we could flip back for just a moment to the book of 1 Samuel and look in verse 42. Chapter 25 and verse 42. 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 42. You might remember the story of Nabal and how David was going to take his vengeance on Nabal because Nabal wouldn't help him out. And Abigail, Nabal's wife, kind of stepped in. But then Nabal kind of died of his shock of what had happened. And so in 1 Samuel 25:42, it said Abigail rose in haste, and she rode on a donkey, and she was attended by 5 of her maidens, and she followed the messengers of David, and she became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and so both of them were his wives. But Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was from Galim. And so he'd taken David's first wife and given her to somebody else. Obviously not a good thing to do, but was Saul's prerogative at this time as her father. And so David marries these other 2 women. These are the mothers of those first 2 children, which we know Amnon, he's going to cause lots of problems later on for David. And then another son named Chileab, which we don't know a whole lot about. And so these are 2 women from the land of Judah. They're Judahites that David marries and has children by. The third one, we're told, was Absalom. Now that's one of David's more famous sons. He's the one that leads the rebellion. And when he dies, David cries, "Oh, Absalom, my son Absalom." Absalom is the son of Maacah, who is the daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. Now, Geshur is in Philistine territory. And so, in other words, this is probably a political marriage. And Absalom is half Philistine. He's half Jew, half Philistine, and his mother comes from the Philistines. And so when you get to Absalom, and he runs away to Geshur, to the Philistines, I had never noticed this before. That's because that's his family. That's his mother's family that he's running back to. The 4th son, Adonijah, is the son of Haggith, and the 5th, Shephatiah, is the son of Abital, and the 6th, Ithream, by David's wife Eglah. Now, as far as I know, there's really no information about who those women are, if they're Jewish, if they're from other countries, political marriages. We don't really know who these women are. But these are the sons that were born to David when he was in that 7.5-year window in Hebron. And so it kind of gives us this picture of his family there. But then we're going to zoom back into the war in verse 6. And it says, "Now it was so, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was strengthening his hold on the house of Saul. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And so Ishbosheth said to Abner, 'Why have you gone in to my father's concubine?'" Now this is to go into a person's concubine at this time, what is in essence to try to take their place. If he's a king, then basically you're saying, "I'm announcing myself as king by taking his concubine." That's how this was understood at this time. I know it's kind of a foreign thing for us, but that's how they understand it, and that's why Ishbosheth is so upset about it, because Abner has said, "You're king," but then he took Saul's concubine. And so he's saying, why are you trying to take my father's place? Why are you trying to be king? That doesn't work out very well for Ishbosheth.
What verse are we in?
This is verse 7 of chapter 3 that we just read. And so in verse 8, Abner became very angry at the words of Ishbosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show loyalty to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and his friends, and have not delivered you into the hand of David. And you charge me today with a fault concerning this woman. May God do so to Abner and more also." And it's interesting how he says this in verse 9. He says, "If I do not do for David as the Lord has sworn to him." All this time, Abner seems to know that God promised David the kingdom, and it kind of raises the question, why is he fighting against David then? If he knows that God is going to deliver the kingdom to David in the first place. He continues in verse 10, he says, "To transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the name of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan to Beersheba." And so, in essence, he's saying, I'm mad at you now, and so because it's convenient to me, and, by the way, the Lord says this anyway, I'm transferring my loyalty over to David. And you can kind of see the selfishness and the greed of this man, that he only does it how God wants it when he feels like it's his best option, when he feels like it's his best possibilities. And so verse 11, Ishbosheth was afraid and he did not answer him. And so Abner sent messages on his behalf to David saying, "Whose is the land?" And saying also, Make your covenant with me, and indeed my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel to you. And so David says, good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing I require of you. You shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. And so he agrees to make a covenant if he'll return his wife back to him that Saul had given to somebody else. And so David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself, for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took from her husband, from Paltiel, the son of Laish. And then her husband went along with her to Bahurim, weeping behind her. And so Abner said to him, go return. And he returned. Apparently he was very fond of her. And David says, she needs to come back to me. I'm her rightful husband. And that was clearly very hard for him. But all of this is a part of Abner and David kind of making this alliance and bringing us closer to the end of this war. And so verse 17, Abner had communicated with the elders of Israel, saying, in time past, you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then, do it. For the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and the hand of all their enemies. And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. And Abner also went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. And so Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron. And David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to David, I will arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires. And so David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. And so Abner, now he's a member of the tribe of Benjamin, so he has the political clout to convince all of these people to choose David instead of Ishbosheth. And so now that it serves his purpose, he convinces them all, and they have this feast. That's sort of a way of that's how they signed the contract, right? That's how they sealed their covenant together, and it's all looking like the war is coming to an end. But then there's the little seed of vengeance that kind of springs its head up, and that's what we find in verse 22. At that moment, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid, and they brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. In other words, Joab, remember, that's the three brothers, David's nephews, and Abner killed his brother. Joab didn't know that this was happening. He didn't know that David was making a covenant with Abner. And so when he returns, it says in verse 23, when Joab and all the troops that were with him had come, they told Joab, saying, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he sent him away, and he has gone in peace. And so Joab came to the king and said, what have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why is it that you sent him away, and he has already gone? Surely you realize that Abner the son of Ner came to deceive you, to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you were doing. And so Joab tries to convince David that Abner is some kind of spy, and that he should have just, killed him or done away with him or something when he had the chance. And that's what Joab intends to do. Verse 26, when Joab had gone from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner and brought him back from the well of Sirah. But, and this is important, David didn't know it. Joab didn't ask, could I do this? He didn't tell David his plans. He's working outside of David's knowledge. And when Abner had returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him privately, and there stabbed him in the stomach, so that he died for the blood of Asahel his brother. Now notice, it doesn't say he died because Joab was trying to actually keep David safe from the deceptions of Abner, does it? This is about vengeance. Right? This is about, you killed my brother, and I'm going to kill you because you killed my brother. And Abner, I assume, feels like they can talk privately because he's made a truce with David. And so he thinks, well, Joab is not going to break a truce that David has made with me. And he doesn't anticipate, I suppose, the bloodthirstiness that Joab shows so often in these books. Now, there is in the law of Moses a clause that talks about the avenger of blood. Basically, that's if you murder somebody, his closest relative can come and take vengeance on you, according to God's law, unless you make it to one of those cities of refuge. Why does that not apply to Joab here? Why can he not be the avenger of blood for his brother in this instance? Why is Joab wrong for doing this? That's right, yeah. It's wartime, and that's you anticipate in war. If someone chases you down to kill you and you turn around and kill them, that's what you do here. The avenger of blood is about those instances where somebody has unjustly, murdered your close relative. It talks about out in the field or what have you. But that I've kind of heard that before. That well, Joab didn't do anything wrong. He was the avenger of blood. War changes all of that here. And so afterwards, here's David's reaction. When David heard it, he said, "My kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and on all his father's house. And let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who has a discharge or is a leopard, who leans on a staff or falls by the sword, or who lacks bread." And so he's sort of invoking the curses of the law of Moses on Joab for his vengeance, because as we all know, God's very clear. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Joab has broken that. And so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. And David is basically saying, I didn't authorize this. I didn't know about this. I am not guilty of this. Joab bears the guilt for what he chose to do for our brother. All right, any thoughts or comments here? Yes, it's a lot of names. Yes, it is. And trying to keep them all straight. Yeah. And a lot of kind of intense, gory kind of stuff that's happening in David's life. You kind of get a sense of why, when David wants to build the temple, God says, you've sort of seen too much blood. I mean, you just look at all the things that are happening in David's life here. It was a very bloody kind of situation, as civil war is. Verse 31, then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, he says, tear your clothes, gird yourselves with sackcloth, mourn for Abner. And King David followed the coffin. That was a really great honor. For now, remember, just a day ago, or so, Abner was David's enemy. He had taken Ishbosheth and said, "You will be king and not David." They were fighting a war and battles against each other for the last couple of years. But now that they have this covenant, now that they have an agreement, David himself, the king, follows the coffin. That would have been a really great honor. That'd be like if the president showed up at your funeral, and came and said something or something to that effect, a really great honor for Abner. And so they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king sang a lament over Abner and said, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put into fetters. As a man falls before wicked men, so you fell. And then all the people wept over him again. And when all the people came to persuade David to eat food while it was still day, David took an oath, saying, God do so to me and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down. And now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, since whatever the king did pleased all the people. For all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's intent to kill Abner the son of Ner. And the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too harsh for me. Right, talking about his own nephews. The Lord shall repay the evil done according to his wickedness. Now here's what's so important about David here. And remember, he's called a man after God's own heart. Here's what's so important about David here. Abner was his enemy, but when they make that covenant, it's very clear. David forgives all of that to such a degree that when Abner dies, David feels very deeply that death. David really struggles with all of that and wants all of that to be made right. It's very much a picture of we are all God's enemies when we are in sin. But when God forgives, he forgives completely. And he is completely on our side and wants what is right for us when he forgives. And This is why you see David is an image of God's own heart, because so many of the things that David does, they very much line up with what we see that God does. All right, we're going to wrap it up there in chapter 3 tonight and pick up in chapter 4 in a couple of weeks. Yeah.